Hello my friends, welcome back to another episode of My Antics. I hope you had a wonderful 4th of July with a lot of fireworks, barbecue, and spending time with your families. I myself watched the sunset and it was a beautiful sight to behold. But I'm glad to be back in the ant room, and I'm glad to announce that this whole episode is going to be about how to take care of your first colony and or a brand new queen right up from when you first create their test tube. Let's jump into it. If you've done it once or you've done it 100 times, making a test tube setup is very simple, but there's a couple important keys to remember to make sure that the function of the test tube is set up properly. You would need a test tube, any kind of long object, like a paintbrush for example, some cotton balls, and some water, preferably bottled water. Tap water has a lot of different chemicals that I found really don't have a good influence on the ants, and though it may not kill them, I feel like just to play it safe, bottled water and distilled water is probably the best way to go. First off, start with your cotton ball. Though it seems loose and almost like a spongy, I always like to rip them in half. You want to make sure that it's not a tight fit cotton ball when you push it into the water. After that, depending on the size of your colony, queen, or exactly how long you want it to last, I like to fill it up to about 50% for bigger queens and colonies, to about 75% for smaller species and queens. Might have a little bit too much there. After you've figured out exactly how much water you want to have, you take the loose cotton ball that you just ripped in half and you stick it into the top of the test tube. Now this is where the bubbles begin to appear. If you push the cotton down slow or take your time, bubbles will appear in the water, which means there's no suction, there's no water seal, and even if your water evaporates, the cotton will continue to stay exactly where it was put while the water evaporates. Take your long object and quickly push it into the water. As soon as you do this, you create a water seal. The water pressurizes the cotton with nowhere else to go, and when the water eventually evaporates, it'll suck or drag the cotton down with it all the way till it's out of water. After you get to this point, depending on what it looks like, you can slightly push around the edges just to get a clean looking cotton, and you are ready to go to put your queens or colonies in your test tube. I've seen a couple different ways to start raising your queen ant, but the most universally successful method is a test tube. With the constant supply of water and a humidity level that's hard to match, it's the perfect way to make sure that your queen gets to her first workers and eventually into her nest. Now that we know how to set up a test tube, let's talk about moving a new queen into one. And I just have the perfect lady for the job. With your new test tube completely set up and ready for a queen to move in, it's finally time to take her out of her temporary container that you have her in and move her into the test tube that she'll be growing in for 4 to 6 months. Always make sure you have the air cotton on hand, because at some points the queen might actually try to escape when she feels open airflow instead of the sealed. Instantly, the queen notices that she has a chance to escape and quickly bolts out of the test tube. If this ever happens to you, you can gently pinch her between your fingers to give a temporary grab on her and put her finally in her new home. Come here, little queen. It is time for you to meet your new house. Success. When you first put your little queen into her new test tube, you're going to notice that she's not going to recognize the pheromones. In fact, there's no pheromones at all in her new test tube. So there's going to be a point when she pulls at the cotton, runs around frantically, and seems really upset. But this is completely normal, and this is the beginning stages of her starting to lay down her trails and realizing that this is home. If you haven't noticed already, the queen that we just saw was a parasite queen, otherwise known as Lasius Neoniger. Queens in general that are parasitic don't have the ability to start colonies on their own. Some are called slave driver ants in the Formica species, but in Lasius, they really are assassins waiting to attack. You see, they start adding pheromones to themselves that mimic a colony that they're stalking. Eventually, they gain the trust of that colony, moving slowly but steadily toward the real queen. Eventually, when she has her chance, she will behead the real queen and take over as the official queen of the colony. All of the old workers will die out, and eventually all of her Lasius interjectus workers will take over, and that'll be a booming colony for years and years to come. Let's take a look now exactly how you would prepare this queen for success. Growing a parasitic queen in captivity means you already have to have your stars aligned to do it correctly. I have a Lasius Neoniger and a Lasius brevicornis colony ready to go. If you don't have these species at home, I would just let the parasitic queens go and really start looking for a full claustral queen that you can raise normally. We're going to be gracefully taking a couple cocoons out of each of these colonies and adding them to her. With the cocoons and larvae in place, it's time to reintroduce her to the test tube she was just in for the last time. Again, she's going to be a little bit spooked out, but she's going to notice, right away, that she has cocoons, and now she has a chance to successfully start her own colony once they mature, hatch, and finally start taking care of her and the eggs that she will lay when she's comfortable. Giving our parasitic queen some mature brood and cocoons is a huge step in the right direction, but she needs one more thing in order to be successful, which brings us to our next subject, and that is semi-claustral queens. Most parasitic species, along with Pogonomyrmex, Formica, and Trapjaws, the list goes on, are semi-claustral species that aren't built to last long periods of time without nourishment. In the wild, these species will leave their founding or queen's chamber, go out looking for dead insects or honeydew, something to keep them alive until their first workers arrive. In captivity, it's our jobs to make sure that we give them everything they need to survive. In the harvester's case, you can give them seeds along with protein and sugar, which in most cases can be as simple as crickets, birdseed, and honey. But in other cases, non-harvesters, just having some kind of a protein, even if it's a scrap of deli meat if you don't have anything else around, just to make sure they have something to munch on until their first workers arrive. Now then, as soon as their first workers come into the scene, like any other colony, you'll be feeding them weekly, and they will mature like any normal colony. Now that we have a better understanding about semi-claustral species, let's go ahead and prepare a meal for our Pogonomyrmex californicus and our Lasius interjectus queens. Our harvester end here does have one worker, so I'm sure they're going to be more than delighted to have a treat. I will be preparing a roach here, and there's a little bit of gut removal required. I'm going to start by cutting off the head, so if you have any problems with any kind of guts, now would be a good time to look away. But if you want to watch, just so you know for future reference, it's definitely a good learning experience. I like to personally cut the roach into sections. I try to get the legs in every section so there's a little bit more meat for them. I normally cut the end right in half. As you can see, there is guts that you have to remove. This is the stuff that if it hardens, it can actually lock the ant's jaws shut and kill some of the workers. So it's something that we never want to happen to our little girls. After this, we can take the middle section. That looks about good. And let's move in a little closer. Because it's just a queen, and a queen with one worker, it may take a little while for them to discover that they have a meal. So let's move on to fully claustral species and their care. When it comes to full claustral species, it's pretty straightforward. A new lone queen can survive all the way up to her first workers with water alone. She has an extra large abdomen and increased wing muscles that she can use to fast with until her first workers arrive and they start foraging for food. Closest to us, we have a beautiful, majestic Prenolepis imparis colony, famously known as the false honeypots. Behind them, we have a Lasius Neoniger colony with over 20 workers. As we said a little bit earlier, feeding them is pretty straightforward and the same game, if you would. The false honeypots won't be that difficult. With 3 workers, there's really not that much of an issue, and there's no way they're going to overwhelm me while I maintenance them. Ants love honey, and sweets in general. A matter of fact, it's all the workers eat. Did you know that workers have a strict sugar diet and do not benefit from protein whatsoever? Instead, the protein that you put in the colonies for them is fed to the queen, which makes her produce more brood, and it's fed to the brood themselves to help them grow quicker. So yet again, the workers do not benefit from protein at all, but it's still a great idea to make sure you add it regularly. When a colony gets a larger number count like this, you want to make sure that you always have an extra cotton around, just in case they do happen to swarm out of the test tube and you need to act quick. In a situation like this, you always want to make sure that you close their air cotton first and then slowly collect the other workers that have escaped either in a separate test tube, or you can put them in one by switching their air cotton with the loose cotton you have caught them in. Right away, I know that I'm going to have a couple workers running around. There's a couple on the air cotton that I just took out, but they seem pretty calm for the moment, which is really good for me. Because they have more workers, I want to make sure that I add a decent amount of honey for them. This honey source will keep them active and moving all week long as they care for the queen, the brood, and maintenance the colony altogether. After they get their fill, they will eventually move over to the protein, which they will store in their social stomachs and feed to the brood and the queen. One last thing I do want to mention, but you have to be so careful, extremely careful, is even if you see a small air bubble, like you see right here, that means that the water seal is no longer in effect. And at that point, you can either switch out their test tube, or you can use their cotton like a sponge. By taking an extremely skinny object, you can slowly move to the back and gently press back and forth on the cotton closest to them, which will bring the water back to them to make sure they have water. One of the biggest mistakes I've seen ant keepers make is thinking that the ants have water when in all reality all of the cotton from them to a little bit in is completely dry. And it's not a good feeling to realize, so it's definitely something you want to check. Now remember, you don't want to push so hard as to flood the test tube. That would be a catastrophic failure, and you would have to move extremely quick if you want to save the colony and the waterboarded brood. So after we do this for a couple times, we know that they have water. And another benefit is the workers that were on the cotton when I took it off are still on the cotton, so I can push them right back in with no escapees. Wow, look at them go for that honey, guys. Let me see if I can zoom in on that. That is crazy. And more or less, the method shown here can be done with crickets, mealworms, along with nectar, sugar water. You can even put in grapes, any kind of fruit really. And in worst case scenario, I know a lot of ant keepers don't seem to have any feeder insects on hand. Like I said before, you can feed them tiny scraps of deli meat or even leftover meat like steak or hamburgers. But that's at a last resort. Make sure that you get them feeder insects as soon as possible because they do best with the gooey innards that they can suck in easily. What happens if that you give them a dried cricket or a dried mealworm that was frozen is they literally have to lick it until it becomes a pasty like goop again, which is like 3 times the work. And after they get it goopy again, that's when they suck it up and they feed it. But I don't feel like that's as healthy. So I know you know where I'm coming from here. The gooey innards of a fresh killed insect is definitely the easiest for them and the best choice for a protein altogether. Soon after your colony hits the 15 to 20 worker mark, they're finally ready to move into a nest, and the test tube care and setup no longer apply, though I highly recommend still keeping a test tube water setup in either with their outworld or somewhere along the way, because that's what they know best, that's what they were raised on while they were growing in their test tube, and that's something that they're definitely going to come back to as something that they have common knowledge of. Let's go take a look at some of our colonies so we can talk about a little bit more about the care that has to do with day-to-day, week-to-week of being in a nest. The 2 biggest accomplishments of any ant keeper are when your lone queen has her first nanitics and that colony is big enough to move into a nest. When you do succeed in growing them to that point, there are a couple things that change, but it's along the same lines of care. You still have to regulate their temperature and humidity a lot more than they did in your test tube, but the perks of it is it's a lot easier to take food out and put food in, along with maintenance their outworld. Their nest, on the other hand, can be a little bit more difficult to maintenance, but hopefully your colony does the right thing and puts their trash pile in their outworld for you. If you followed my Antics ant rule, the Black Voyagers and the Avengers are 2 ever-growing colonies that we have up and running. The Black Voyagers just got a brand new upgrade for nests. And to make them feel more comfortable, I put their heat cord right underneath their water base. This gives them a buildup of condensation so they have an extra way to drink, and it helps them feel more comfortable as they gradually put their pheromones down and get used to the nest. Eventually, these little ladies will move right into the middle and continue where they left off, but for now, they're inching their way forward and growing their numbers as they do. The Avengers, on the other hand, are still in the classic black and white vortex nest, but they're doing amazing in their own sense as well. They are flourishing like a huge forest, taking over fields, and they went from having 15 workers to over 45 in just a couple weeks. They also have their very first majors, which exoskeletons are still hardening, but it's still epic to see. I don't see this colony stop growing anytime soon, and I have a good feeling there's going to be over 100 workers by the end of the season. Congratulations, Avengers, and congratulations, Black Voyagers. You truly are the epic colonies of the ant room. Lastly, I believe all ant keepers should have some kind of a kit for their ant keeping arsenal. The must-haves are skinny objects for pokers, paintbrushes and tweezers, test tubes and cotton, and spray bottles. Also, a small pair of scissors, Fluon, some kind of a trash bucket, and maybe some spare honey would be an epic way to get your first kit started. Ant keeping is a hobby of epicness that goes back hundreds of years, and by now has probably touched millions of people's lives around the world. Making sure you know all of your bases and knowing exactly what you're getting into is a big head start when you're beginning. Even general videos, though are very helpful, don't necessarily prepare you for every single individual species. If you have a dream species in mind, make sure that you study them specifically because they may have needs that others don't. They might need substrate, sand, dirt, or other different obstacles that some videos just don't cover. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope by the end of this you have a better understanding of what ant keeping is, what it's going to be involving, and if you're already an ant keeper, a better idea how to be better today than you were yesterday. I hope you enjoyed and have a wonderful night, and as always, happy ant keeping.